Hello, and thank you for downloading audio from Crosspoint Church. To find out more about Crosspoint, visit us online at www.crosspointga.com.
3 of our Christmas decoration series, and in so doing, we've kind of approached the concept of, and the premise that, man, so many times for us, Christmas starts with our Christmas decorations. Once the decorations go out, that's when the season begins to gear up. But in it, man, you have all the pizzazz and all the lights, but there's just something missing. And there's something to our declarations when we declare things. And so what we've been doing is going through the scriptures in the Christmas story and seeing specific declarations that were made by characters within the Christmas story. And today we're going to be looking at the Magi, or AKA the wise men. But before we go there, I want to talk about a particular Christmas story that I think has similarities to the one we're going to. Many of you are familiar with A Christmas Carol, right? It's really old, very popular, something that's really good to watch around the Christmas season because it has just such a good and impactful message, way better than Elf or any of the other ones that are out there. And it really conveys just the Christmas message of generosity so well. So in the story, you have several characters, first of which is Ebenezer Scrooge, right? And nobody wants to be like old Ebenezer Scrooge. Ebenezer Scrooge is just this guy who's got this grimace face. He's stingy. He's got no joy. He's just completely a stick in the mud when it comes to Christmas. Then you have Bob Cratchit. Bob Cratchit is Bob Cratchit is another guy who's in the Christmas story, and Bob Cratchit is, I guess, the guy that you really want to focus on. He's the character. He's generous, but he's not. He's got no money. He's broke. He's just really losing out. He's working for peanuts. He can't even have any coal in his. He's got no coal to heat himself with, and his boss is just really, really mean. And some of you can connect and resonate with that a little better than other people, right? But there's one particular thing that I wanted to, and I was hoping I could show it to you, but anyway, in Time Magazine in 2011, there was a story that they did on the Misery Index. How many of you have ever heard of the Misery Index? Anybody? No, you're like, I'm on it. Oh my goodness, right? In the Misery Index, okay, so what it does is it's kind of like the wind chill factor. So you know the wind chill factor, they measure the degree of cold that we have, and then they couple it with the actual wind speeds, and that's like, okay, that's your wind chill factor. So it may be like 41 and sunny, but the wind chill makes it feel like it's 37 and, blistering rain, and everybody's getting chapped lips and stuff like that. It works similarly in that it couples the unemployment rate that we have, and it also goes with the inflation rate. So you have unemployment rate with inflation rate, and it gives you the misery index. And I really had some cool stats on there that I was really hoping you could see. But there's it was dreamed up in the 1960s, and it kind of has been used ever since. And they've got like the misery index under Obama and Trump and Carter, and it's all laid out there, and you could see what the ratios were. Well, the misery index is something that, in combining those things, I think we can learn and see some things for us in our misery index and where we are by looking at 2 particular characters from the Christmas story, and that is the Magi and also King Herod. Okay, so we're going to kind of play along with that a little bit. Now, when you think of the Magi, you're like, what are those? It's the wise men, what we know as the wise men in the Christmas story. And with the wise men, we have all these things that are conjured up in our heads, right? You have like 3 guys on camels, and they're wearing really shiny clothes, and they have kings, and they're singing as they ride along on their camels. And that's usually what we think of with the Magi. But the reality is when we look at the Magi, it's most likely all jazzed up in the commercial scene. These guys were most likely not on camels. They were on Persian steeds, because Persia was known for their horsemen and all of that. And most likely there was probably more than 3 or maybe less than 3. Just because there were 3 gifts doesn't mean that there were actually 3 guys on camels singing. And they most likely were not in fancy shiny garbs as much as they had just crossed the desert. And man, imagine how your car looks when you just go down Camp Little Light Drive here, okay? These guys crossed the desert. They're not shiny. They're not looking good. They haven't shaved in a while. They haven't bathed. These guys are looking gnarly, right? But they've come and they're seeking to minister and to bless Jesus. Now, here's the thing. There's some backstory to the Magi that I think is really important that you should know. Because not only are these guys, now we know that they were into astrology and they looked at the stars and all that stuff, but the Magi were very powerful individuals. They were political in nature, and they usually looked into astronomy and astrology, and they were known to be emperor makers, so to speak, because what we knew about 6th century BC, the Medo-Persian Empire with King Darius and others, that they were very focused on cultures. And so they were probably studying Judaism and had found, because, we know Daniel was kind of in the mix there with the Persians and stuff like that, is that most likely they were in the process of taking everything they can learn from a culture and from a kingdom and from an empire and assimilating that into theirs to become the most powerful nation they could. Now, when we look at Esther, we know that the Magi actually sat as judges as well. And so in so doing, they would judge political infrastructures, and the kings would use them as advisors. When we look at Daniel, the Magi were most likely the people that Nebuchadnezzar was looking at offing because they couldn't interpret the dream, because that's what their role was. But also we know that because they sat as judges and they had so much influence with kings, is that they were actually king makers. That in order for someone to become and rise to king, they had to actually pass the Magi's tests, and they had to have Magi approval before they can ascend to the throne. Why? Because the Magi were actually writing and judging most of the political infrastructure as well as the government infrastructure in their day. And we can look at that just from Esther and Nebuchadnezzar, not even looking at many of the other information that we have from Josephus and other historical writings. So what we have in Matthew, when we read about the Magi rolling up, is that these guys are not just some dudes who were looking through a telescope and oh, cool, a star. Let's cross the world and see where it goes. These guys were calculated and they were powerful. So those are some of the things that I want you to have in your mind as we look into this. So Matthew chapter 2, and you're going to have your Bibles today to pull that up. But Matthew chapter 2, and it says this in verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. Now, why do you think King Herod would be troubled? He's a king. Right? He's got his own army, all that stuff. Why would he be troubled about, 3 guys on camels coming into town? Because most likely it was 1,000 cavalrymen coming with these guys. See, the Magi were so important and so powerful, they had their own bodyguards dispatched with them. So imagine you're a king and your army, we know that Nebuchadnezzar had his army sent out in different locations, that you have 1,000+ cavalrymen from Persia coming across into your kingdom. Yeah, you're going to be troubled. These guys were roll up in the scene with power and with pomp and with circumstance. And they came on the scene, and Herod is troubled because we've got kingmakers coming into our area, and I'm going to be a little bit worried. So what happens is, in verse 4, and when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. Verse 5, so they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of it shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. So Herod's doing some math, And it sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, that when you have found him, bring him back and bring me word to me that I may come and worship him also." Now, Herod is lying. We know that because many of you know the Christmas story. You've seen it on TV and stuff like that. But Herod is lying, and he's manipulating, and he's using the wise men. He's using and taking advantage of the Magi. Why? Because Herod has a long, long history of using people for the benefit of his own good. Herod was just a ruthless, bitter guy who used and did so much to people. Verse 9, when they had heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star, which they had seen in the east, went before them, which is really cool. That stars move and stuff like that. Awesome. Till it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And man, really interesting that he's in a house. So many times we look at the Christmas story and we're like, they're right there at the manger, and they arrive shortly after the shepherds, and they're like high-fiving the shepherds and fist bumping and elbowing. And, you got guys all dressed up in canonical hats and shiny garb, and then you got the shepherds all dirty. Most likely the shepherds were probably cleaner than these guys. And we look at it, but really, because of the way the star worked and what we know and what the scriptures say, that Joseph and Mary are most likely in a house by now. So they were, who wants to stay in a stable that long? I mean, if anybody here, if you've had kids, moms, you're like, right, get me out of that thing. Give me some running water, some AC, grape juice, whatever floats your boat. You're wanting to get out of there as soon as possible. Mary was no different. So this was either a year later or possibly 2 years later, but they were not coming in the manger scene. Sorry to spoil that for you, and you probably already knew that anyway. And when they had come into the house, they saw the child with Mary's mother and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their gifts, they presented gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This is the wealth of nations being brought to Jesus, okay? And this fulfills even more prophecies that we know when you can look at Haggai, Isaiah, Zephaniah, all talk about the riches of the Messiah. These are the wealth of nations being brought from afar to Jesus. Now, also these gifts have significance, and you've probably heard, some of the similarities to what those gifts represent. Gold representing the purity and his deity. The incense was the fragrance of his life, what the essence of Jesus' life was going to be like. Myrrh representing the type of death that he was going to have, because myrrh was used for embalming. But all of these gifts were most likely, and this is #God provides, were used by Joseph to get them out of that area to Egypt, because he was warned, and we know Joseph was warned in a dream that he should leave the area and go, and he flees to Egypt. And that's probably how he paid for all of those trips and journeys after being taxed to death by the king in the first place. So man, God is leveraging, fulfilling prophecies, providing for Joseph and his family with these guys, these Magi guys coming from Persia all the way over to here. Now, for sake of time, verses like 12 through 15 cover the fact that Herod was manipulating and had a plot, and an angel comes and warns the Magi, and they don't go back to Herod, and they go to their country another way. But it starts off in verse 16 saying, "Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry." He's an angry guy. "And sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from ages 2 years old and under, according to the time which had been determined by the wise men." And this is the saddest part of the Christmas story that doesn't get a lot of traction, is the genocide here that took place, the murder of the innocent children in the Christmas story. We don't like to focus on it because it's ugly and it's gnarly. But you know what? Life is ugly and gnarly. And so many times in the midst of the Christmas story, we like to focus on the beautiful things. But the reality is that the world that Jesus came into was ruthless and evil, just like it is today. And there were threats to Jesus as an unborn child, just like there's a threat to the unborn today. And this is something that is timeless and continues to perpetuate itself throughout history. But thankfully, Jesus comes to redeem all that. And that is not something that you're ever going to see when He is on the throne and when He is ruling. And His law is the law of the land. But yeah, the wise men were warned. And they... and another thing, too. And history... A lot of history and people say, well, Matthew's account of the gospel with the Magi, I mean, what's the deal with that? That's not anywhere else in the Gospels. And also, too, this whole thing about Herod slaughtering all these kids, that's not found in history. There's nobody who's recorded that. But you look at Herod. Herod is the kind of guy that, man, he's concerned about his reign. He's concerned about public opinion of him. He's secretly meeting with the Magi. You think this kind of king isn't going to, erase that stuff out of the history books? Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, most of the things that are perpetuated throughout history are usually the good things, right? You have this side note and somebody kind of does some reporting and gives us a little bit more. But Herod is the kind of guy that was going to do anything and everything to ensure that he had the most, that nobody took his reign from him, and that he was the kind of guy that would often change history if he needed to. I mean, what we know about Herod is that he had already murdered several of his sons to protect his own throne. So killing other people that were not family was nothing for him. That he built and bolstered his own kingdom by building structures like Masada, which was the fortress in Israel, and really cool. I've been there. It's amazing. And then also he constructed the new temple, Herod's temple. He built it to kind of give an olive branch to the Jewish people, and then he suffered throughout his lifetime with depression and paranoia. Herod was a messed up guy. As a matter of fact, Josephus writes that Herod was so hated by the people that he had actually taken a group of the most influential people in the area and had held them hostage in prison and given orders that upon his death they were to be killed so that the people would actually mourn while he was dead. Because he knew they weren't going to mourn for him, so at least there would be crying for somebody. Now, that didn't end up happening. His kids, and I believe his sister Salome actually ended up, not carrying out those wishes. But here's the thing about Herod. And the thing that really I think we need to pull out of the Christmas story when we're talking about misery indexes is that Herod continually throughout his life loved money but used people. He loved money but used people. He was always trying to keep himself on the throne so that he could have the most, resurrecting structures to have the most for himself. He was always doing that. But here's the thing. Money is meant to be used, not loved. People are meant to be loved and never used. And Herod loved stuff, loved money, and he used people. And so many times around the Christmas season, we can get sucked into this mindset and get sucked into being a little more like Herod than we think. Now, you would say, well, I would never kill kids, and I would never off my kids to, protect my throne and all that stuff. That's totally not me. But what we also know is many times that kind of attitude and mindset is a slow fade. It's a slow fade, and we arrive at those things so slowly and so over the course of years that we become more like Herod than we realize. And you know how you do that? It's the way in which you view money, the way in which you view stuff versus the way in which you view people. Now, the Magi were completely opposite. The Magi took their gifts, the wealth of nations, and they crossed the desert, inconveniently, mind you, to see and worship a child and lay their gifts before him. And you know what's so important about that? Is that they were willing to let go of their wealth to worship a baby, to worship Jesus. And I don't know about you. I don't know where you're at. I don't know what it looks like, what your checkbook looks like, what your giving list looks like versus your receiving list. But many times we're more like Herod than we think. And we could take a page out of the Magi's book, so to speak, and see that before they ever fell down and worshiped the baby, that they had already began and started to worship him with their money. They had already set aside their gifts and took those on the journey. And before their hearts ever followed Jesus in worship, they had first done so with their money, with their wealth, with their riches. And around this time of year, when generosity is hurled and used like candy canes are on trees, right? There are a lot of them. We tend to overlook our own personal generosity and begin to look at how are people going to be generous to us? What are we going to get this year? But the Magi were focused on what they can give. Herod focused on what he could receive, how he could protect what little bit he had. And in the grand scheme of things, he was a king. He had a lot. He was a ruler. But man, which one are you more like? Now, Jesus upped the ante. And in Acts chapter 20, verse 35, it says this. Jesus is being quoted here, and he says, "And remember the words of Jesus that he said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.'" It is more blessed to give than to receive. And see, so many times in the process of our lives, we are not generous. And in this time of year, maybe we let go a little bit more than normal. But if you're here this morning and generosity is not something that you could relate to, if you would say, and you were to look at the way in which you give and say, you know what, I have a little bit more in comparison with Herod. I'm trying to keep things and stuff tight to my chest. I'm focused on what I'm going to receive, not so much as what I'm going to give this Christmas season. Jesus' words apply to you and me today, and that is, man, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Now, factually, we know this, right? I mean, there's people who've published studies about the effects of generosity. That when we give and when we're generous, that we have it produces a neurochemistry within us that moves at a chemical level within our minds. That endorphins and dopamine and all these things flood our minds when we are giving, when we're generous. But if you go back to the misery index, which I was hoping you guys could see, what we know about the misery index is that in the process of people being miserable, it also affects their generosity. See, the less generous you are, ultimately, the more miserable you are. And historically, as a nation, whenever the misery index has been high, our generosity as a nation has been low. And ultimately, when our generosity is high, the misery index is low. And I think at a national level, we could apply that to a personal level. And that is this, is that when you and I are more generous, when we are like the Magi, and when we take our treasures and our possessions and our wealth, and we focus on giving them back to Jesus, being obedient to what Jesus said, and knowing that it is more blessed to give than receive, that our misery actually shrinks, and that we are not so much like maybe Ebenezer Scrooge, but we're more like the jovial person in the Christmas story and even in the Christmas Carol. And that, man, what we need to do today, what you and I have to begin to bring into the posture of our Christmas season is not more decorations, is not adding more things to our receiving list, but saying, how can I be more generous? How can I be wise like the wise men and focus on what I can give, not what I can receive? How can I flood my economics, my personal economics, my checkbook, my wallet with generosity and ultimately be less miserable? I mean, if you're known as the Ebenezer Scrooge in your family, right? If you're the guy who's walking around, guy or gal, with a frown on your face all the time, and you can't seem to find anything to be happy about, first step for you would be to give more away. Just to give more away. And like the Magi, when you practice generosity, your worship of Jesus is going to elevate. You cannot worship Jesus and not be generous. Because the very premise of worship is financial. That's why every single Sunday we give an opportunity for you and for me to give sacrificially and generously in tithes and offerings. And we said this last week. Generally, if your finances are the most destructive and just most chaotic part of your life, chances are it's the most unsurrendered area of your life. Because the more surrendered your checkbook, your wallet, your purse, for all the guys who carry purses, if you do that, please don't do that. We will make fun of you. It is, I totally lost my train of thought there. I just pictured like somebody carrying a purse or something. This totally messed me up. If you, and you're all laughing, so it's not helping any. Please stop that. Clay's got a nice purse. I thought it was a backpack. Oh my goodness. But yeah, if your finances are chaotic, it's the most unsurrendered portion of your life. And so if you want to reign in your finances, if you want to see God's blessed and the blessings both in your physical and mental state and also even in reality in your finances, you're going to surrender that to Jesus. It should lead to worship, and it's ultimately going to bring a better Christmas to your life and to your family. So this morning, the saying that I want you to focus on, and man, the fact that I want you to receive is that it is more blessed to give than to receive. That the words of Jesus were really already etched into the Christmas story, even though they're found in Acts, which is after he's passed and after he's in heaven. He's being quoted that the premise of the Christmas story is that it is more blessed to give than to receive. And Herod died a miserable, miserable person. Many believe that the way he died was miserable and he almost like rotted to death. But man, here's the deal. You can drain Amazon dry of all the good self-help books. You could drain Amazon dry and have truckloads of stuff delivered to your house in 2.5 days, I think is the average. You could highlight the best things. You could complete all the things that you want. Check it off your list. But man, it is not going to resonate anything in your soul as much as the words of Christ when he said it's more blessed to give than to receive. Generosity will undo the misery that you experience in your life. Generosity will elevate the worship that you have this Christmas season, and it'll make you and your family have the best Christmas you could possibly have. Because that is what we see in the very essence of the Christmas story, is generosity. Generosity and giving to our Heavenly Father, giving in generosity to Jesus before he even needed it. And those wise men left happy. And Herod died miserable and went down in history as a homicidal maniac. It's your choice. Right? You're going to end up and die a homicidal maniac. Josh's face was like, what? There was more to it. Trust me, there was more to it. I'm going to die. Man, where's my wallet? Let me pass the offering plates. Drain it. Well, I'm going to give online. Oh my gosh, my whole checking account. Oh my goodness, I don't want to die a homicidal maniac. No. But that process is a slow fade. It's a slow fade, and generosity completely undoes that. Completely undoes that. So for me, for you, for all of us, generosity is going to lead to the best Christmas that we could possibly have. Amen? Let's pray.
Thanks again for downloading audio from Crosspoint Church. We hope that this content was supplemental at best in your spiritual growth. We believe the best way for someone to grow in their relationship with Jesus is in a local congregation of believers with like faith, passion, and direction. We hope you will go further in your exploration of Crosspoint by visiting us one Sunday at our worship gatherings. Details are on our website, crosspointga.com. God bless.